All right, I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this lovely evening. For those of you who are in the Portland area, we're having a really lovely evening. So thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. My name is Cheryl, and I'm an adult services librarian at the Westland Public Library. Welcome to Houseplants 101, presented by Master Gardener Kris LaMar. At this time, you should have your mics and your videos turned off. We will have time at the end of the presentation for questions, so feel free to add those questions to the chat box anytime. If you haven't heard, the library has reopened for indoor holds pickup. All of our programs, though, are still being offered virtually. So if you're interested in seeing what we have coming up, I'll put a link for that in the chat box here in a moment. That's enough for me. So I'm going to turn this over to our main presenter. So let's welcome Kris.
So this is Houseplants 101. I suppose if you are attending, you have some interest in, perhaps you have your own group of houseplants that you've known and loved. You may have gotten into it because your grandmother or great-grandmother wanted to share what I used to call the old lady houseplants, the African violets. But houseplants have really become an important part of decorating just during my lifetime. And I enjoy watching how different HGTV shows use plants in doing that. So here's what I would like to have you know or accomplish by the time we're done at the end of an hour. And I hope to leave time for questions. But first of all, to figure out what makes a plant appropriate for growing indoors. And some of them come in only during the winter when it's cold. Others can live and thrive indoors. Second, to take a look at what houseplants' basic needs are and what differences you need to look out for as you are trying to assess both what plants to acquire and how to take care of them in your house. And finally, to identify common problems of different plants. And they do vary from plant to plant, and they vary from household to household. So what may be a healthy plant in one household may not be a healthy plant of the same species next door. So first of all, some definitions. A tropical plant is a plant that doesn't need to be in a house. It grows naturally in a tropical climate. We have a USDA map that I'm going to show you in a minute that doesn't have many tropical areas because most of the United States is at best in subtropical. So Florida and Hawaii are the states that have native tropical plants that often end up in our houses. And a tropical climate is typically hot and humid. I'm going to talk about both of those in just a bit, with temperatures constantly and sometimes even at night exceeding 65 degrees Fahrenheit. They don't have to worry about frost days, and they're able to tolerate our homes if we emulate their native conditions. Otherwise, they won't thrive. An annual plant is a plant whose life cycle is one growing season. So it forms foliage, roots and foliage if it's growing from a seed in the spring. And then it produces flowers and seeds during the summer. In some cases, it produces nuts and fruit, and then it dies in the fall. And the mother plant waves goodbye to the little seeds and says, "Keep us going, please." A biennial plant is a plant whose life cycle is two growing seasons. So a seed begins to grow in the spring. It produces foliage during the summer, then it loses the foliage in the fall. And if you leave it in the ground, it will continue to grow that same pattern the next spring. And it's only in the second year that it produces flowers and fruits and seeds. And a perennial plant is a plant whose life cycle is indefinite. Not that they're all immortal, but it's a plant that you have to pay very little attention to. And all of the plants in your household fall into one of these categories, but they may become annual or perennial, especially depending upon whether the conditions, especially heat, are able to keep them going in that fashion. But then things get complicated because we also have hardy annuals. It's an annual, such as a radish or even spinach, capable of resisting frosts or light freezing. So they can really become essentially year-round under the right conditions. And then there are tender annuals, such as a tomato or squash, that's not able to withstand cold. It's injured or killed by the first frost. Then a hardy perennial is a plant that can survive outside unprotected over the winter. And a tender perennial is a plant that can survive, but not in cold climates. You can have all of these as houseplants if you just know how to take care of them, but they require different treatment. So this is the USDA plant hardiness zone map. If you go to this website at the bottom, you can actually put in your zip code and it will tell you what the temperatures are that have historically been the low average temperatures in the winter. And here on the right, you'll see a scale, and you can see that the hottest areas, the reds and the oranges, are down in our two tropical states. The further north you go, the colder the winters are. Now, that's not news to any of you, but this becomes important when you're trying to assess what type of plants you want to have both outside and inside, and which types will probably be successful if you make them houseplants either for half or the entire year. Why do you want to grow plants indoors? Well, it gets too cold outside for the plant's survival. You want to make sure that the mature plant remains a size that's compatible with the house structure and or can be moved outside during the warm months. Now, I would submit that this ginormous plant on the left fits in this ginormous tall library, but I don't have a room unless I start tearing out the ceiling that plant could survive in my house, or at least it will soon outgrow it. There's a saying in the horticulture world that the right plant in the wrong place is the wrong plant. And this plant would be the wrong plant in my house, but it might work Buckingham Palace, although it needs a lot of light. So you can put it in a tall room, but if the room doesn't have enough light, the plant isn't going to survive. And then you have to make sure that the plant's care needs are within the gardener's capacity. I'm sure there are several of you who are getting to the point that I am, that even using a trolley, it's difficult to get plants, especially the heavy, large ones, in and out in the spring and the fall. And it's just easier to pick a different species that actually fits your environment. Now, all plants essentially have the same needs. And remember that of the three major kingdoms, plants, animals, and funguses, there are other ones that are microbes essentially, but the plant kingdom are the only living things that can create their own food. They can feed themselves. I don't mean they can make a grilled cheese, but they sustain all of us because the fungi and the microbes, and especially the animals, all depend on plants to keep us alive. So first there's light. I'll begin with the sun. And there are different, obviously, sources for light, and there are different intensities and duration. I'm going to tell you in just a little bit about how that's important for houseplants. Secondly, water. We're going to talk about the source of the water, what's in the water, where you put the water, how often, and when to do it most efficiently, both to help your plant and to keep problems that could develop with your plant if you don't do it correctly. And then nutrients. The nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium are the three macronutrients, and those are the numbers that you see when you pick up a fertilizer container. And they're in that order, they're alphabetical. And then micronutrient needs, and those go all the way from boron to zinc. There are 13 of them. You may not ever have to worry about them outside because clay has, for the most part, all of those micronutrients. But inside, that you could have a deficiency in your plant because it lacks one or more of those micronutrients. And then finally, the environment. what are the roots of the plant being held in? It has to be a type of a system that your plants can have air. And it's not because the roots need air, but because the water goes down through those micro spaces to get to the roots. The right size container. I'm sure you've all seen containers that have root bound plants, and they're not going to thrive. And finally, where do you keep them in your house so that they will have the maximum environment to succeed? Now, let me talk for just a second about what not to do. I got this beautiful arrangement when I had some surgical procedure. I wish they would have just knocked $500 off the bill and forgotten the plant, but here it showed up. And so here's this gorgeous orchid. An orchid is an epiphyte, which means that its roots are above the ground rather than below. It needs infrequent, not very often, fertilization of a balanced fertilizer. That is, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are about the same, and a bright light. Now, the Dracaenas need good drainage. They require 10-10-10 fertilizer during a growing season and low light. And then, of course, the container is too small for the Dracaenas and the orchid, even though the orchid roots are epiphyte should be above. There's no reason to put them in this tiny little container. So, of course, the first thing I had to do was to take all of these out. And this is the Dracaena here that's the variegated. And this looks like a red tip Dracaena. So I had to tear the whole thing apart and put them in entirely different containers. What plants are appropriate, though, as houseplants? And what plants are not? So inappropriate. Well, the major type of plant that should not be kept in your house, especially in the winter, are plants that need what's called a determinate, a finite number of chill hours. And if they don't get that minimum number of either cold or in some cases below freezing time, they're not going to produce fruits or nuts. They may continue to provide foliage, but that's probably not what you got them for in the first place. So those have to be left out in the winter. And most of our large scale gardening is this kind in fruits and nuts is this kind of plant. But the other problem, and we saw this in the previous slide, was plants that grow so large or which require such large containers, and you don't want to buy a plant just so that you can prune it. That would be the right plant in the wrong place. So you need to do a little research ahead of time. And some plants, indoor plants especially, are rather expensive. So consider this to be an investment that you need to check out before you write the check or give them your credit card. Water is at the top of the list. And one of the issues that I have when I talk to a large number of people in different parts of the county or the state or even the region is that we have a variety of different types of water available. If you live in a municipality that has a system where whether it's taken from a river or from the soil, it may well have chlorine in it, for example. So, and Lord knows what else. It may have contaminants, including pesticides. So some plants are very sensitive to the type of water that they have. So in order to limit those kind of problems, using well water or rainwater or distilled water will help you and your plant to avoid the problems that those additives have when we buy them through our taxes, essentially. So what's in it? Many people have rainwater collection systems. The problem is that if you are using water that's collected, that's run off a roof, you may well have chemicals that have been placed there to get rid of moss or other copper, for example, and you may be giving too much or a bad additive in the water that you don't even realize. Be sure that you water the soil. That's where the roots are, not the leaves. I'm going to share with you in just a bit why that's a bad idea. And then plants' water needs vary widely. but they all need good drainage. And I said most because we water the succulents, cacti, for example, very little in the first place. But if you have it in a container, it absolutely has to have great drainage. And then timing, watering in the morning will allow the soil to dry out during the day so that if there are any pathogens, fungi, bacteria, they're not keeping that soil and the root ball wet overnight when it gets cool, and then those pathogens go to town. And then humidity. Plants that are tropical in nature need more humidity in home environments than cacti do. And this is going to be put on YouTube, so you can come back and get this article to read. It has a really good chart about how much light, water, and humidity most of the houseplants that we have, what each of their needs are. Most houseplants need 50% humidity, but we have a clock that has one of those registers in it, and ours happen to be about 55% today, but many homes, that, especially that have forced air heat, have only 10% humidity. Don't miss the leaves, because on the leaves are microbes, airborne microbes that drift in from outside, and you're going to get spots on the leaves, among other problems. So it doesn't help to miss the leaves. Don't water the leaves. Put the water where it needs to be put. Now, one of the things that you can do, you can see that this is water being poured on a saucer. You can enlarge this idea to a big tray, for example, and putting gravel, which helps the evaporation rate of the water, and set your plant containers on top of them, so that as this evaporates, it keeps the plant in a little bit. I mean, if you had a covered structure, that would probably be better, like a greenhouse, but it gives them some better humidity than you're going to get in what your house has, probably. And then light. So water and light. Now, I have had many gardeners in the course of my time as a master gardener who argue with me because when they write in with a question or a problem that a plant's having, especially when it's a plant that is tipping to one side, going toward the light, they'll say, well, I write back and I say, well, your plant just isn't getting enough light. And they argue with me because they say it's right next to a window, it gets lots of light. So this graph on the left shows you the two wavelengths which plants need the most of. That is, in order to make chlorophyll, which is what happens when you have photosynthesis, or the need for photosynthesis, you can see where these are. The sun has the full spectrum. Plants don't necessarily need so much here. Well, in about 1946, they started putting various substances initially on automobiles, and then it went to aviation, and then it got transferred to housing in order to keep solar, that is the hot rays of the sun, from getting into our houses. They put these shields on the outside, the screening. Here's a true screen, but and they're incorporated into our glass now. You don't even know that they're there. And then radiant heat, which is what is the wavelength that causes problems when you have fading upholstery and rugs, for example. So that concept was transferred from vehicles and airplanes to homes. And in the meantime, our plants aren't getting the part of the light spectrum that they need for photosynthesis. If you put a screen on outside of your window, you're going to compound the problem. The light just simply won't get to your plants. So that's why it has been invented alternative sources of light. So incandescent, which has been around forever, they don't have the blue light, the ultraviolet light. They're too hot, as you know, if you've ever gotten close to one, and they don't live very long. Fluorescent, which we have every place, it seems like, have red and blue light, they're long-lived and they're cool. So we started using fluorescent light bulbs as a way to help plants that were growing indoor, either from seedlings or mature plants. Just within the last probably 20 years, we now have high intensity or gas discharge HID lights, and those are pretty good for growing plants. But we now have LEDs, which are used quite commonly in greenhouses and homes and for seed starting operations for plants that are going to be transferred outside. And then finally, if you really want to go high end, you get plasma lights, which are full spectrum to be sure, but they're also very expensive. So the LEDs are the ones, and you have to make sure when you're getting one that it is a full spectrum so that they're getting all the way from the highest to the lowest parts of the wavelength. And then nutrients. So I referred to the macronutrients, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and each of them helps the plant in a different way. Nitrogen is for greenery. So the plants that we grow inside that don't have flowers produce a lot of foliage, and they are nitrogen rich, nitrogen needing. Phosphorus is helpful for root development. So for example, outdoors, if you're planting bulbs, you want to add something to the hole and you'd add a high phosphorus fertilizer nutrient. And then finally, potassium, which is critical for flowers and seeds. And since most of our houseplants don't produce those, you probably have to have less potassium. When you look at a fertilizer label, the numbers tell you what the concentrations are for each of those three macronutrients. So for 10-10-10, there's 10% by weight of nitrogen, 10% of phosphorus, and 10% of potassium. You will rarely find many houseplants, houseplant fertilizers that tell you much about the micronutrients, but they range from boron to zinc. They're needed in very small amounts. And some fertilizers do add them for specific houseplants, but you have to read the label. And speaking of the label's the law. Use commercial fertilizer of any kind and only the concentrations and intervals is how often do you use it, as the label suggests. Otherwise, you're likely to burn the roots of the plant, or if you don't add enough during the growing season, especially, which inside is kind of year round, the plant may have all kinds of nutrient deficiencies that you can get very frustrated trying to figure out what they are and how to cure them. So here are just some of the more common commercial fertilizers that are available, and you can see the wide range that these concentrations have. Cactus Food, cacti don't have the foliage in the same way, so they have very little nitrogen, but the phosphorus and potassium are greater in percentages. And they also tell you what, if any, of the micronutrients are added. And for some plants, for example, orchids, you do need these micronutrients. So read the label, figure out what kind of plant you're buying it for, and then take the time to read the label so that you're getting the right type of commercial fertilizer for the plants that you're growing. Some fertilization issues. Fertilize weekly, unless the plant's needs or the fertilizer label indicate otherwise. You can overdo fertilizer in houseplants in containers in the same way that you can overdo them out in your yard. You want to be sure that you run water through the pot every 4 to 6 months to prevent salt buildup. Now, when I say salt, I'm not talking about sodium chloride. The nutrients that I was just talking about, especially the ones that are minerals, when they aren't absorbed by the plant and they're left on the top of the surface, that's called a salt. And as it builds up over time, and eventually it can be harmful to the plant and can burn the plant's roots and severely retard its ability to produce foliage. So you want to remove the salt, if you can just take a spoon and remove it, but then run mineral-free water, we were talking about that before, through, and then refertilize. So the salts that I was talking about are minerals, and those are included in fertilizers that are dissolved in the water, and they stay behind typically on the top of the surface. They get concentrated when the water evaporates, and they can inhibit the plant's uptake of water due to damage to the plant's roots. And please avoid soft water. It has minerals in it that will kill more plants faster than any water additive I'm aware of. Don't confuse, though, the salt crystals that I was just referencing with a fungus that can also grow on the surface of your pots. I mean, you can tell because these are really clear photos, but if you were to pull yourself away from these from a distance, it's often difficult to tell. And this is a very, what you might call furry fungus, but some of them look a lot like the salt crystals. So if you can pull them apart really easily by taking them off the top of the soil, it's probably salt. If they're hooked to each other through these, they're called mycelia that you've probably seen on the underside of rotting trees. This would be a fungus. You don't want the fungi there either. There are good fungi and bad fungi, but take them out of your houseplants as soon as you see them. Now, we get a lot of questions at the Extension Office about what type of soil do I want to put in my container garden for my indoor containers. Don't bring in our native soil. It contains insects, pathogens, including bacteria and fungi, a whole host of things that are required outside in that soil. And if it's clay that you're bringing in, I guarantee it's going to be too heavy once you add water to it to allow you to relocate the plant or even to rotate it sometimes in the house. So look for a potting mix. I'm not endorsing Miracle Grow. I just wanted to find one. And it says feeds plants up to 6 months. If you read the small print, you'll actually find how much of that is the 10-10-10 or 5-5-5. And you'll often find that it's very, very tiny amount. So don't pay more money for a potting mix that has added nutrients, added fertilizer. You can probably make it go further if you buy it separately, frankly. And then the size of the container. Now, there are plants that actually prefer being slightly root bound. Orchids are some of those, but other ones need room to spread out. So you can see this looks like a dumb cane, a Dieffenbachia, and it's probably been in that pot since it was first started there. That may be years, and it's become so entrenched, engaged in that container that frankly, the roots have lost the ability to take in water and nutrients. And don't be afraid to hack these roots away because they're going to regrow into new potting soil. Again, all of these need good drainage. Do not use containers that don't have a hole in the bottom. And plant the roots too tightly crowded, your plant's going to fail. You can see how Dieffenbachia, in my experience, are kind of hard to deal with anyway, but it's really drooping, and that's just because there's no place for this plant's roots to uptake any water. And then where are you going to put it? Well, we get excited about spaces, and then we plant our plants so closely together that there's no good airflow. And a surefire way, other than root rot, for your plants to die, is for airborne pathogens, fungi and bacteria, etc., to spread among the plants. So keeping a distance between them is helpful. You also, you could spend probably an hour looking and identifying all of these plants in this cute little place. I mean, nice little place. But the plants that are here all have different needs. There are some that are succulents, some that require high humidity, and they have very different light requirements. I can see about 4 different types of each of these just in this rather busy picture. So do your research and then group them together so that this applies outside as well, so that you can water plants at about the same rate that are in the same area together. You don't have to remember all of their distinct needs. And as we said before, don't plant indoor plants that'll outgrow the area. These plants here are too close together, and this guy has a plant that's probably going to take over the office. and how, I don't know, maybe he can, but I certainly am having more and more difficulty lugging these plants from one place to another. You can put them on movable trays, but in an office setting or many home settings, that's just not available. Now, I want just to tell you a couple of benefits of houseplants. Many years ago, NASA, in anticipation of taking plants to space, wanted to research various species of plants that would clean the air. And I'm just going to scroll through here that some of them that you may already have, some of them are rather common, others are a little rarer. And you can see the kind of plants that you might want to have in your house, especially your bedroom where you spend 8 hours a day, where you want to have fresh, clean air. This is probably one of the only places that anyone would recommend English ivy, because it's not going to take over your yard, and it'll not become invasive as long as you keep it pruned. A footnote regarding propagation. You probably recognize these as spider plants. And there are underground structures that produce new plants at the end of them called rhizomes. And these are actually airborne ones, but at the bottom of each of these, they have root structures. And you can plant them and create new plants. So when you saw the little plant, coming off this mama spider plant, you're really looking at probably about 14 plants, at least in terms of what you can make them into. And then peace lily and I do not get along, but they're gorgeous. Anthuriums can be a little temperamental as well, but they're beautiful when they're in bloom, especially in the holiday season. And the snake plant is actually also called a mother-in-law's tongue. It's a cactus, or succulent. You can tell that it doesn't mind being root bound, and it's one of the best plants for cleaning the air. And of course, the reliable philodendrons that are in many cases difficult to kill. Several of the dracaenas, some can be temperamental, others not. And some of the indoor plants that can actually, if they have enough light, not only provide cleaning tendencies for the air, but they also produce flowers. And you've undoubtedly all seen these. And then these are the orchids. I know orchids very well. I've killed more than probably all the other kind of plants that I have. I suggest that before you invest in them, that you do some research, because they have very different needs. They need very amounts of light and water. But here's the moth orchid. The Phalaenopsis is the one that you see in every grocery store in town. If you're into it, they're great. But they're also good air cleaners. But here's some other benefits of houseplants. According to Healthline and some other scientific resources, they increase memory and concentration by 20%. I don't know how they could test that, but I'm just reporting to you what I read. They say that you can actually do better task performance and become more accurate if you have plants. And of course, we know that just because they're beautiful or we bond with them, your senses and your mind are stimulated by them, because you're thinking of something outside of your own needs at that point. Now, drop a footnote. Pets have the same benefit, and they take a lot more intensity, but just things that get us out of ourselves. And they allow us to share, kind of like what we're doing right now. There is a reason that we take houseplants to people who are sick or in care facilities or hospitals. And those are places that maybe the air really does need to be cleaned, but they cheer us up. And we're happier when we're in the middle of plants. Now, if you're a singing homeowner, if you sing to your plants or sing around your plants, now this has been tested, especially in greenhouses. If you sing, you will help your plants thrive. So they're making you happier and you're making them healthier. Now, why is that? It's scientifically based. It's because when you're breathing out carbon dioxide, which is necessary for the plants to have to photosynthesize. But they're giving you back the excess oxygen that they don't need through the photosynthetic process. And so you've got cleaner air, and they've got, which is a waste product in photosynthesis, the oxygen, but you're getting rid of your waste product by giving it back to them. Marriages come in many forms. Now, here are some of the things that bother indoor gardeners the most. Many of them are brought in from outdoors, and I'm not going to go through control of all of them. These are aphids. These are scale. This could be a variety of many types of caterpillars. So these are spider mites. You need to carefully examine your plants. I would say at least once a month. And if you take your plants out in the summer where they're going to be available for these insects to attack them, and then you bring them in without hosing off the plant or checking for them, you're really opening yourself up to losing a lot of plants because many of them are easily transferred from one plant to another. Scale, not so much, but scale are just nearly impossible to get off. You have to use a Q-tip with alcohol or something like that. Whitefly ditto. Here are some not so common ones. This is a leaf miner. You can get them on indoor plants and thrips, etc. And this is just a little caterpillar that's the cutest little caterpillar I've ever seen in my life, and you probably won't find them in your house, but it's going to town eating. They're little eating machines. If you start seeing notching on the outside of your plants, you do have some kind of a caterpillar that you're going to need to deal with. And then pesticides. So a pesticide is something that kills a pest. We have herbicides that kill the plants. We have insecticides that kill insects. We have miticides that kill mites. We just saw the mites earlier. And one of the problems that we see at the Extension Office is that gardeners don't identify the pests, whether it's an outdoor plant or an indoor plant. They see an insect, they get all bent out of shape, and then they've just got to kill it. Sometimes you're killing what will help you protect your plants. I know that a lot of people have arachnophobia. They're scared of spiders. If you have a spider indoors, that spider is eating something that you really don't want. So if you see spider webs around your house, you know that the only way the spider is staying alive is by eating the insects that you really didn't want to share your premises with. So try to figure out by taking a picture and sending it to us at the Extension Office, or doing some research on your own, try to find out what it is that you have there, and do you really need to get rid of it? Spiders being in that category, probably not. Start off by either trying to pick the pest off, or if you have some kind of a species of a plant that just naturally attracts those pests, maybe you need to find a different home for it, or put the plant outdoors. Now, only during a season where the cold isn't going to kill it, put it outdoors, because the pests that you see, the insects that you see on your plants are food for some other, probably larger insect. If you feel as though you have to use a pesticide, now right now I'm talking about pesticide, not just insecticide, but also, for example, the fungus that we saw growing on the top of the plant. If you feel as though you have to use a chemical to get rid of it, be sure that you read the label, that it's appropriate for use indoors, because it can harm you and your lungs and your skin and your eyes. And there's a reason that they're marked for indoor or for outdoor use only. And then follow the label directions. One thing we don't have to worry about quite so much inside is a pesticide drift, that is the the wind takes it further or on top of plants that we're not targeting. But indoors, you can be a potential source of harm to you if you don't read the label and use it as it's indicated. And finally, I want to point out that, let me get back up. There are some plants that are harmful to pets. I don't expect you to remember these, but I'd suggest that before you put a plant any place in your house where your pet, primarily cats and dogs, obviously, would have an opportunity to chow down on it, that you go to the ASPCA database where they have extensive, I can't tell you that they're 100% of all the plants that you might consider, but I suspect it's pretty close to it. And they will give you toxic and non-toxic plants for cats, dogs, and horses. And if you have a horse in your house, well, you'll probably have more use for that latter one. But if you just research ASPCA toxic plants, you'll find a very, very intensely thorough database so that you don't have that plant in the house in the first place, or that you know you need to keep it in a place, a high place or a room that you keep closed that your pet can't get to. And this has been my words to live by for years. Never go to a doctor whose office plants have died. They probably won't know much about pesticides. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Kris. So everyone, if you have questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. Kris, how do you keep, so you can get plants that are not toxic for your pets, but you still don't want them to eat the non-toxic plants. Are there ways to keep your cats or dogs from munching on your plants?
I really think that exclusion, that is putting them in a place that your plant cannot, or your cat or dog cannot reach them, is the only surefire way to do that. When I was growing up, my mother, I recall, used to use mothballs. Mothballs are toxic to animals, and they're toxic to many plants. So the worst thing that you can do is to put mothballs on top just because they smell bad, but the chemicals in them might kill your plant before they kill your pet. I suppose you could, put your potentially toxic plants in some kind of a screened environment or behind glass. But really the easiest one is just to keep them so far away from them that they can't get at them in the first place. There are no other surefire chemical or other means that I'm aware of, just exclusion.
Thank you. Another question, do Boston ferns need special care? I kill my fern every year, replace, kill, etc.
Well, I've had the same experience. The two problems that the ferns have is inadequate light. And many people over and under water. So paying attention to the light information that I gave you earlier, and actually during the summer, one of the healthiest things you can do for really any kind of fern is to take them outside, either I'm not recommending full sun, but in some kind of shaded area, because they do benefit from those parts of the light spectrum that getting the light either from our incandescent light bulbs or through windows just doesn't afford them. And they're very nitrogen needing because there's so much foliage, there's so much photosynthesis going on because there are so many leaf surfaces, unlike some of the other, jade plants and rubber plants, etc. So attending to how much of the fertilizer you're giving them, and that they're getting enough water. But right at the top of the list would be light. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to grow them under something not an LED light, and I've had exactly the same experience. So it's not that they're fussy, it's just that they need a lot of light. And they're an understory plant in the wild, in the tropics, and then they get a lot of filtered sunlight, but it's sunlight. They get water. If you spend time in the jungle or tropical areas, they get water that drains really well through around their roots wherever they're planted out in the wild. And so they cannot stand to sit in water that isn't flowing through. And most of us put them on saucers, and sometimes it is too much water for them. So water and light. Third on the list would be adequate nutrients.
Okay. If a house plant is dying, is it best to try and revive it or give up? I've tried reviving an aloe plant, repotted, changed sun exposure, watered correctly, and it's still dying.
Well, one of the problems with trying to diagnose a plant problem without looking at the plant is that I can't tell how it's dying. If you're starting to see browning around the leaves, and this is pretty true of any plant, it's probably a root/watering issue. Most people overwater their aloes. They're succulents. They don't need a lot of water, and they have to have. I think they're grown most successfully in what you see advertised as cactus mixtures. Cactus potting soil. It's really not soil, but it's more sand, and so they drain much better. But you put them on a windowsill or something, and they're not getting enough light, but you're probably overwatering. So when I ignore my aloes, they go great guns. When I try to give them too much love, I kill them off every time.
Good to know. All right. Someone had asked about non-toxic pest control, and another person said, what about watered down Blue Dawn dish soap to wipe down on the plant to get rid of pests?
I would suggest that you use organic pesticides. And I have, of course, all of that information on another PowerPoint. But if you just do a search for organic pesticides, you'll find quite a few, many of which come directly from plant tissue. That's the definition of organic. My go-to fungicide, insecticide, and miticide is neem oil. I think there has been far too much non-scientific information about using Dawn, and why it's Dawn is beyond me, but that's not sanctioned or recommended by any extension service or agricultural university in the United States that I'm aware of. There are some soaps that can be used, and they're organic and used according to the label. They're actually quite good at controlling pests. But what works on your dishes just does not work on your plants. So do a search for organic pesticides, and then make sure that, as I said before, the pests that you have accurately identified will be a good target for whatever pesticide that you discover. I don't have a list of them, but I would just say you do a web search. And one of the ways that you can make sure that you're getting accurate information is that when you type in, for example, organic pesticides, then type in site, SITE:/edu. That'll take you to a website or a publication from an agricultural university where you're getting scientific information. And I have never seen any of those sources, and I've visited them tens of thousands of times. I've never seen one recommend any dish soap as an effective way to manage pests.
All right. Next question. Someone's they left for 10 days and their plants weren't watered. Now they're kind of brown with spots. Can those plants recover?
Probably not. Probably not.
Okay.
Just like you have to eat every day and maybe drink every day, they have to at least drink every day. So that's what I was referring to earlier, is if you see brown tips around on your plant's foliage, it's probably because they are having a root problem, and that's either over, or in your plant's case, under watering. Having a good friend in the neighborhood who can come over and water your plants will save more plants than you could ever imagine.
All right, next question. My peace lily seems happy, but doesn't reflower. Any tips?
Light. They need muted light, and you can put them outside as long as it's warm enough. You can put them outside in a shaded area, and they'll get those parts of the light spectrum that I was referring to earlier. They do not like direct sunlight, but they do need some environment where they can get the entire light spectrum. That's true virtually of any flowering plant. The leaves create the food that create the flowers. So if you're not getting enough light to the plant, there's inadequate photosynthesis to produce the flowers and seeds. You might want to invest in an LED if you want to have some continuous flowering peace lilies.
All right, next question. You talked about like picking fungus off the surface of the dirt. Is there a way to prevent that from growing, or is it just one of those things that it just is going to appear and is that the best way to combat it, just to pick it off like that?
It got brought in somehow. There are some potting soils that are not sterilized. So when you buy them, you probably don't pay any attention. Who does? When you buy them, you may be looking more to see if they have nutrients in them. They have come with some kind of fungus that is hiding in the soil. It is very rare that you find a houseplant that has a fungus growing on it that is growing in the sterilized soil. Now, you can sterilize soil yourself. That is, you can buy potting soil and sterilize it by putting it in the oven, and I think it's something, and I'd have to look this up, something like 200 degrees for 15 or 20 minutes, and that kills the pathogens in the soil. I will warn you, however, having done it once, that it kind of stinks up your kitchen. So, because what you're really doing is you're also heating up the organic material, which may be peat moss or coir, that forms the basis for the plant's roots to be able to penetrate and secure the plant in the soil. So,
Okay. Is there anything that can be done for succulents that are getting leggy?
well, there are thousands of succulents, so it's hard to say what to do with one or the other. And I suggest that you look up, if you know the species, look up the type of plant the succulent that you have in the first place. Some of them can be pruned, and then you can actually use that excess material to propagate a new plant. But for many succulents, the reason that they get leggy is that they don't have enough light. So if you see a plant start growing and it doesn't have much foliage on the stem, but it keeps growing in one direction or the other, it's probably growing toward the light. And that's a fairly sophisticated system of hormones within the plant that causes it to bend toward the light. So I suggest that you identify what species of succulent that you have, and then go to, let's say, aloe care site:/edu, and you can read about whether it can be pruned, whether it will do it any good to be pruned, and whether you can use that additional part of it to create new plants. As we saw with the spider plant, those stolons that come out, they're made for that. And that some plant tissue can in fact create new plants. It just varies so much by species that it's hard to generalize about it.
All right, we'll take one more question here. When buying a new plant, what are the things to look for to make sure it's healthy before you buy it?
Turn it upside down and see if there are roots coming out of the bottom of the container. You're going to know a lot about a plant and its root system just by seeing whether there are roots coming out of the holes in the bottom of the plant. Second thing you need to look for is it really green? If it's really green, it means that it's had water and fertilizer and that the plant has been photosynthesizing adequately, superbly. And the third thing to just don't even pick it up is if the leaves are brown, because it's had some kind of watering problem that you won't be able to fix unless you're willing to, I mean, if it's 50% off, you might as well try it, but you'll have to take off all of the foliage that has any browning or spots on it. It's either, if it's spots, it's either caused by a nutrient deficiency or some kind of a pathogen, or it's just necrotic dead tissue that happened because the plant was not cared for adequately. You can cut all the foliage off and start from scratch, but that doesn't work for all plants because they live during the time that there's no foliage, creating food for them to continue to live.
All right, thank you very much, Kris, for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. And I think we're all going to go and try to grow some houseplants now. So thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thank you again, Kris, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I hope everybody learned something. Okay. See you again.
Good night.
Okay, good night. Thanks. Bye-bye.